All right, let's start with a picture that honestly just doesn't make any sense. I want you to imagine a high school history teacher, a guy who just a few years earlier was probably explaining the Napoleonic Wars to teenagers. Now picture him flying a tiny, fragile airplane. Its skin is literally made of fabric, and its engine has less horsepower than some modern riding lawnmowers. And this teacher decides he's going to take on an entire German panzer division by himself. It sounds like something straight out of a comic book, right? Well, it's not. This is the real, almost unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter, a man they would eventually call Bazooka Charlie.
Okay, just look at this matchup. It's absurd. On one side, you've got the Piper L-4 Grasshopper. It weighs about 1,200 pounds, so less than a modern small car. Its frame is wood, its skin is cotton, the engine, a tiny 65 horsepower motor that can push it to a top speed of maybe 85 miles an hour on a good day with the wind at its back. And on the other side, the German Panther tank. We're talking 45 tons of brutally efficient, sloped steel armor, a fortress on tracks. It's carrying a high-velocity 75mm cannon that could vaporize an Allied tank from more than a mile away. It's not just a mismatch, it's a joke. It's a gnat trying to fight a rhinoceros.
So that's the real question, isn't it? How on earth does this story end with anything other than that little plane being swatted out of the sky? And this isn't a trick question. This isn't about some one-in-a-million lucky shot. This is the story of a man who looked at these two completely mismatched machines and decided, you know what? I'm going to rewrite the rules of war from my little cockpit. And to understand how he did it, you first have to understand who he was.
Now here's what makes this story so fascinating. Our hero, Major Charles Carpenter, he wasn't some career military pilot, born and bred for the cockpit. No, he was a high school history teacher from a small town in Illinois. Think about that for a second. This is a man who understood the broad sweep of history, the rise and fall of empires. He grew up during the Great Depression, so he knew what it meant to be resourceful, to make do with what you have. When the war broke out, he enlisted. And his official job? Flying reconnaissance, spotting for artillery, basically being the eyes in the sky. But Charles Carpenter had a very, very different idea of what his role should be.
And this single quote, man, it just tells you everything you need to know about his mindset. He actually said this to an Associated Press correspondent, and it's pure, uncut aggression. He wasn't the kind of guy who was going to just sit back and observe. He saw German tanks rolling across the fields of France, and he felt this personal responsibility to do something about it, right then, right there. He wasn't going to wait for bombers to be called in. He wasn't going to wait for tank destroyers to arrive. He was going to take the fight directly to the enemy with the only tool he had. So this intense drive to attack leads to one of the most legendary battlefield modifications of World War II. Carpenter takes his completely standard, off-the-shelf L4 observation plan, serial number 43-3426 to be exact, and it gets together with some ordnance technicians. Together they start turning this little spotter plane into something else entirely. He nicknamed her Rosie the Rocketer, a little nod to the famous Rosie the Riveter posters back home. And Rosie, well, she was about to become a legend.
It wasn't an overnight transformation. It was a process of trial and error. First, they tried strapping two of the standard M1A1 bazookas to the wing struts. But when he tested them, the rockets, they just kind of bounced off the thick armor of the German tanks. Not good enough. So he went back to the drawing board. He needed more punch. The final version, the one that made him a terror of the skies, was an upgrade to 6 M9 bazookas. These things fired a much-improved anti-tank rocket, a warhead that could punch through almost 4 inches of steel armor. More than enough to go right through the thinner top armor of any tank on the battlefield.
But look, just bolting these things onto a plane not designed for them, that creates a whole new set of nightmares. The 6 bazookas added 106 pounds of extra weight, pushing that little plane to its absolute breaking point. He had to fly completely alone, no room for an observer, no room for error. The rocket tubes themselves acted like giant air brakes, creating so much drag that the plane flew like a pig. The controls got sluggish and unresponsive. And maybe the craziest part of all? There was no gun sight. None. Carpenter had to aim the entire aircraft like a giant flying spear, using things like grease pencil marks he'd made on his own windshield. He was literally aiming by feel.
So how do you even survive an attack like that, let alone succeed? He had to invent his own technique. It was this terrifying high-stakes ballet. He'd start up around 1,500 feet, then go into this wild corkscrew spiral on the way down. From the ground, it would have been incredibly hard for German anti-aircraft gunners to get a beat on him. Then, just 300 feet above the ground, he'd suddenly level out for a split second, just long enough to line up his target. Then came the plunge, a steep, terrifying dive straight at a 45-ton tank. At about 100 yards out,
basically the length of a football field, he'd unleash his rockets and yank the controls back, praying that little 65-horsepower engine had enough grunt to pull him out of the dive before he plowed into the ground.
Just think about that for a moment. The whole attack, from the moment he started that final dive to the moment he pulled away, was less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds of pure, absolute vulnerability. He's flying low, he's flying slow, and he's flying directly into a storm of machine gun fire, rifle fire, anything the Germans could throw at him. His own crew chief said that Rosie would come back from missions looking like Swiss cheese, just peppered with bullet holes. And he'd patch her up, and Carpenter would go right back out and do it all over again. And all of this leads to his defining moment, the Battle of Arachakort. This wasn't some minor skirmish. This was the largest tank battle fought on the entire Western Front. It was the Germans' last big armored punch in this part of France, a desperate attempt to stop General Patton's Third Army in its tracks. And it's right here, on September 20th, 1944, that Bazooka Charlie and his homemade tank killer would face their ultimate test. So that afternoon, the morning fog finally lifts, and what does it reveal? A whole company of German Panther tanks advancing on the American lines. Carpenter doesn't hesitate. He takes off, goes into his signature attack run, and smashes a rocket into the lead Panther, stopping it dead in its tracks. He lands, his crew frantically rearms the bazookas, and within 30 minutes, he's airborne again. On the second run, he knocks out another Panther. By the time he's done with his third flight of the afternoon, the rest of the German tanks had had enough. They turned around, they retreated, their entire attack was broken. One man, in a fabric plane, had single-handedly stopped an armored column. I love this quote because you can just hear the dry, understated humor in his voice. Before Carpenter, German commanders actually told their troops to ignore these little L-4 Cub planes. Why? Because shooting at them would just give away their position. But after Arachakort, that rule went right out the window. Urgent bulletins went out across the German army, warning them about these rocket-armed spotter planes. This thing that was once a harmless little fly was now a deadly mosquito. As Carpenter put it, I guess the bazookas were bothering them a bit. What an understatement. His final official count is just staggering. 6 confirmed tank kills. And these weren't just any tanks. That number includes 2 Tiger I heavy tanks. The Tiger, the most feared, most heavily armored beast in the entire German arsenal. Now, some of the unofficial reports from his fellow soldiers say the number could have been as high as 14 tanks. But even if we just stick to the 6 confirmed kills, that achievement, with that weapon, it's still one of the most improbable and heroic feats of the entire war. But here's the thing, Carpenter's story isn't just an amazing tale of bravery. It's bigger than that. When the smoke cleared and the war ended, his actions left behind this powerful legacy, an idea that would actually change how the military thought about fighting for decades. This wasn't just about one pilot anymore, it was about a whole new way of thinking.
And if you want to understand that new way of thinking, just look at the money. It's insane. Carpenter's entire setup, the planes, the bazookas, all of it, cost maybe $5,000. A single Tiger tank cost the equivalent of over $100,000 back then, a massive industrial investment. What he did is a textbook example of what military theorists call asymmetrical warfare. He achieved one of the most incredible returns on investment in the entire war, proving that a little bit of cheap, simple frontline ingenuity could defeat incredibly complex and expensive technology. And you can still see the echoes of his actions today. We already talked about how he forced the Germans to change their tactics, but more importantly, his whole concept, a slow, low-flying aircraft that can deliver precise firepower to support troops on the ground, that became the direct inspiration for the modern attack helicopter, like the Apache. He proved that sometimes the best ideas don't come from generals in a war room, but from the soldiers themselves, the ones on the front line who see a problem and figure out a way to solve it. And the most incredible part of this legacy, his actual plane, Rosie the Rocketer, survived the war. It was found in a barn in Austria decades later and was fully restored in 2017. You can go see it today, and you can still see the patches covering the old bullet holes.
So what's the real lesson here? It goes so much deeper than just a battlefield story. It's about a way of looking at the world. Charles Carpenter, the history teacher, was faced with what looked like an impossible problem, a nearly unstoppable enemy. He didn't have the right tools. He had a history degree, a fabric airplane, and some rockets designed for infantry. But he took what he had, and he combined it with his own creativity and just sheer, stubborn will to invent a solution. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? When you're facing your own impossible odds, when a challenge seems completely insurmountable, what tools do you already have right in front of you? What's your bazooka?